Okay, we are going to begin the final panel here now, and I'm going to take my seat and wear another hat as a moderator. Okay, that's okay. All right. So here we are. We've arrived at the fifth panel, and it seemed most appropriate in an event like this where we began reflecting on Ezra and explored many topics of interest to him and tried to think about how to carry forward a certain spirit of Ezra's scholarship. And it seemed fitting to have a final panel where we return the focus explicitly to Ezra Vogel and ponder some of that legacy in a more personal forms of reflection as well. And so the panel that we've assembled here today are old friends, colleagues, family of Ezra, and I'm really looking forward to hear some of the comments that we have. So our first speaker needs no introduction, Charlotte Ikels, and she is Professor of Anthropology Emerita from Case Western Reserve, and the second speaker will be Richard Dyck, who is the owner and president of TGK-Japan. And then to his left is Mary Jo DelVecchio Good, a professor emerita of global health and social medicine in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at the Harvard Medical School. And then to her left is Professor Mary Brinton, who is the Reischauer Institute professor of sociology and also the current director of the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies here at Harvard. And then finally is Yunli Li, who is the director of the International Center of Chinese Studies and a professor in the Faculty of Economics at Aichi University, who has also generously distributed this, the book of the final lecture of Ezra Vogel that some of you have seen as well. So without any further delay, I will turn the microphone over to Charlotte, and we'll start with you. Thank you.
Hopefully this is working. When I first saw the title of this panel, reflecting on Ezra Vogel and his legacy, I thought, that's a big topic. Is there a way to cut it down? So I decided I would cut it down. I'm focusing on Ezra Vogel's retirement legacy. But that's only the first cut. Is it about the books and the research? Is it about all the lectures he gave? I mean, I could just read a list of his lectures and use up all my time. Or is it about what he did differently in retirement from what he'd done before? And what I want to do is focus on three, depending on my time, possibly four, particular activities that I think are quintessential Ezra and that you can draw. I'm going to try to draw conclusions about him from that, but I think you can probably see what the conclusions are going to be as I go along. And one of the first activities I would like to discuss is Ezra and China Soc. China Soc. That is China sociology. Retirement in theory means you're free of meetings, you're free of teaching. But Ezra never really gave up teaching. And China Soc was one of his major ways of doing his teaching. It was a special monthly meeting during the academic year of his doctoral students, well, they're not his anymore because he's retired, but of doctoral students in the sociology department working on China. So they would meet roughly 8 times a year in our house. Somebody, Marty White or later Yao Lei, would take out Chinese food. We would spread it out on the kitchen table and people would go through the line. And then we would sit down and have a chat. You know, just everybody informal. Often Ezra and Marty would talk about the secret history of the sociology department and other matters of interest to students. But the focus was really on helping students who are at different stages of their research projects. Some were only formulating a topic. Others were sweating out disasters during field work. And others were engaged in writing. And at every meeting, after we ate, people would retire to the front room And there would be one student who was on the spot. You know, I've made progress, this is my issue, I can't do it, whatever. And what was particularly impressive was everybody was supportive. Ezra, of course, as you all know, is a very warm, supportive person. He can pull you out of any hole and get you going. And he encouraged all of the students also to be very supportive. And I think that is one of the key characteristics, is he did not foster competition. Just to give you an interesting contrast, I first met Ezra in 1973 when I was a graduate student from a different university, the University of Hawaii. And I was at the University Service Center in Hong Kong on my first summer after graduate school, first year of graduate school, and trying to formulate a research topic. So I had some ideas, and he actually was there that year and had put a little note up on the bulletin board at the Service Center saying, I would be happy to discuss research projects with any of the graduate students here. Wow. I have to say, I've been many times at the University Service Center. That was the only time I ever saw a professor say, I'd be happy to talk with anybody. I mean, this sounds like, you know, you met him in the breakfast line at iHouse, and he'll talk with you, that sort of thing. So I said, yeah, I'm interested in this, and blah, blah, blah. And he, you know, had some suggestions, some of which I followed. And then I went back to Hawaii and continued working. And then one day I got a letter from one of his students, somebody I think many of you know, Deborah Davis, who just recently retired from Yale. And she said, I'm interested in aging in China. And Professor Vogel told me that he had met you this summer and that you had said you were working in this topic. And I'd be curious to know what kinds of, what you want to cover on this topic. And I thought, what can this mean? So I went to my advisor and I said, I got this letter from this student, from Ezra Vogel, and she seems to be interested in working on aging. And my advisor said, tell her you're doing everything. Cover it. Basically, don't let her in. So, many of you know this person, so I am not going to reveal the name. But in any case, I thought that was an interesting contrast. And as some of you may know, Debbie and I divided the field of aging in China. I did Hong Kong, and then she did China. And then later, I moved into China, but she had shifted to social mobility. So we always worked it out. And I think that is really instructive of Ezra. He always encouraged people to share ideas. He really downplayed competition. It's always a win-win, that kind of thing. So that is one example. And he started that when he had retired. The second thing is the famous Vogel Juku. Anybody here a survivor of the Vogel Juku? No, nobody here? Must be somebody here. That was started in 2002 and continued actually all the way into 2020, although it went to Zoom at the end, and it became a very different thing. Now, what was the Vogel Juku? It was nothing like China Soc. It wasn't doctoral students working on Japan. And to be honest, I don't know exactly how it was organizationally sparked. I know where he got the idea. Way back when Japan is Number One came out, he was on a speaking tour in Japan, and I was the dutiful wife on the speaking tour with him. And we got to visit the Matsushita Institute of Government and Management. And Mr. Matsushita explained to us the origins of the school and what his ideas were. And his idea was that the Matsushita Institute of Government and Management will bring together promising young men and women with a deep love for their country who will strive to make Japan a better place in the 21st century. The Institute will offer blah, blah, blah. We aim to facilitate the kind of wide-ranging and comprehensive independent study that our young associates will need to develop a vision and management philosophy of the nation. Noble. Well, that was in the early 1980s. So it was way in the back there. It wasn't up here. But then in retirement, Japan was reaching, as we've heard earlier in these sessions, Japan was reaching wasn't maybe Japan is number one quite so much anymore.
Lost its pizzazz.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Lost its pizzazz. And Ezra thought, we really need to inspire Japan's young leadership to get that spark and bring Japan back. And it was very much this idea of Mr. Matsushita. We need to develop young leaders who can have plans for Japan. And when they go back, they will do it. Well, these were not Harvard students. I mean, there might have been a few incidentally, but most of the JUCO members were people who were temporarily in Japan on various assignments. Some were corporate people, some were students at other universities, a few were at Harvard, and others were members of the Japanese bureaucracy who, for some reason or another, had short-term assignments or maybe one-year assignments in the greater Boston area. And these people were brought together initially. There would be a big meeting at the very beginning of the academic year, and if any of you have seen our house, you will be amazed to know that we squeezed 60 to 70 people in the living room. It must have been at, different depth levels. But that was only the first meeting. Some came just out of curiosity, or some might have been intimidated by the fact that there are actually requirements. You actually have to do something. And what you have to do is foster together, the Japanese group would decide what are the key issues that we should be discussing. So it might be international relations, it might be the yen, it might be aging, it might be healthcare, it could be anything. But they would decide for themselves what the groups were going to be, and then the attendees would self-assign to the groups. And then the groups would meet once a month, would meet with us once a month. They probably met informally among themselves. And each time the group met, a group met, several groups would meet. One group had the responsibility of presenting the program. Today's issue will be international relations, and Mr. So-and-so will. And Ezra insisted it be in English because they also wanted to facilitate English language development and confidence. So typically, Wednesday night, or just before the night, Ezra would call up Cafe Sushi and say, I want 2 Vogel platters and 2 Vogel specials, which they knew. And these 2 huge platters would show up in the nick of time. The Japanese, for their part, brought the pizza. And I did not really participate in this since I'm not, if you can do China, you can do Japan at some universities, so I did have to teach Japan. Fortunately, I had resources. But I was not as involved in that except for getting my piece of pizza and some sushi. But their responsibility was eat and then go into the living room and have this discussion. And while group 1, or attendee group 1 is in the living room, the second group would come and have the second box of sushi and so forth. And then that group would leave, and this group that had just finished eating would go in. And this was repeated on Thursday. I have to say, all the Chinese doctoral students and all of the Japanese JUCO people were very helpful in cleaning up the kitchen and taking leftovers, so it worked for me. Let's see. So the JUCO went from 2002, as I said, to 2020, and they sent, upon hearing of Professor Vogel's death, they sent a very nice volume of, year 2002, used the 2003, so we have that as a very nice gift from them. So that was the JUCO. Everybody had to work, they had to have a specific goal, and the goal had to be basically of service to the country. That is to say, Japan. All right, the third program, I'm running out of my allotted time.
You can have as much time as you want, Charlotte.
The third program is the U.S. China National Committee's program called the Public Intellectuals Program, or the PIPs. If you were a member of the Public Intellectuals Program, you were a PIP, and you were a PIP 1 or a PIP 2, and I believe there is a PIP 2 in the room at this very moment.
There, yeah.
There's a PIP 2 person right there. So correct me if I misrepresent what the PIPs are supposed to do. I only heard what the man told me. I was not a PIP myself. All right, so the Public Intellectuals Program was launched in 2005, and it is dedicated to nurturing the next generation of China specialists. And one of the concerns that the committee, and Ezra himself had, was that, Harvard has a lot of people. Boston Globe, the New York Times, when I talk to somebody, lots of people. This person say that, get this other person say something else, that's fine. But what if you are writing a newspaper out in Cleveland, Ohio? Who do you go to? Well, at Case Western Reserve University, the largest private research institution in the entire state of Ohio, there were 2 China people, and often only one. And the very sad story is that the one was me. And in my 26 years at Case Western Reserve University, I was contacted exactly 0 times. Now, no, I'm not taking that personally. Don't get it. That is not my point, that I was upset. I was not upset. The point is, 2 points. One is, there wasn't a level of interest. Who cares what's going on in China? From the point of view of Ohio papers. And the other was that, truth be told, there was another institution more well known for China studies in the neighborhood, which was Oberlin, 20 miles out. Although I just spoke with somebody from Oberlin who confessed that they don't have that many people, but, you know, they might be contacted. So the point is, what the PIP program was intended to deal with this kind of situation, that there are many parts of the United States where even if a decent university exists, they don't necessarily have more than one person who does China. And that person could be history, art, anthropology, economics, government, who knows what. But the range of questions that they would be expected to address is going to extend way beyond their own disciplines. So this program, the PIPS program, was designed to particularly draw on young scholars who were from less endowed universities in terms of multitude of scholars in the China field, and try to get them up to speed, at least to the point where they would have a broader interest themselves, and that they would be at least somewhat more prepared to address some questions, or at least, and I think this is an important point, they would know who this reporter could contact, because they were part of a network. Every PIP cohort was a strong network. And again, it was Ezra's idea that it's a win-win for all of us. You know, if the world learns more about China, or if the US learns more about China, any contribution any of us can make is very, very useful. So he traveled with the PIPs to Washington, where they would have a session with Congress and with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where we have a State Department, and people in the State Department. They would then have a meeting in Beijing. They would also travel around China. And obviously, Ezra's presence was enormously helpful, both in the US, but especially in China, in terms of getting them access to people high in the bureaucracy. And I've heard many funny stories of how when they learned that when Jan Barris of the National Committee said, you know, we're coming with another PIP group and we'd like to see so-and-so, and they said, is Vogel going to be on it? Yeah, okay. So then, you know, they would get the access. So my point is, extended too long, and I'm sure you can draw all these conclusions, and since I've lost my sheet of paper, whoa, where'd it go?
I think you were right here.
No, that's not it. Anyway, let me just make it up. What I was going to say is there are 3 things that one learns about Ezra. One is that he is a very generous person, that he is goal-oriented, and a very optimistic person. The second is that he really believes in facilitating communication and contact and collegiality. I think that is central to his success. I mean, it makes everybody want to meet him again. And thirdly, he is goal-oriented. All of these activities were at some level a commitment to service. You know, knowledge, relationships, solving problems, you know, getting Japan back on its feet. This kind, not that it was not on its feet, but you know what I mean, getting it going again. So the legacy would be to continue that kind of attitude, that kind of approach. And that's about it.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Mary Jo, I think you should go next.
Yeah, hard accent.
I don't want to follow that.
I know. I'm jealous. There wasn't any of those. Actually, I'm going to do a little nostalgia. I call Ezra mentor-in-chief. In 1968, so we're going back to a time when you didn't know him. He changed my life. Ezra took me into a social relations PhD program in comparative sociology. And I was thinking of you, William, and you beat me, 1954. He set up this program to bring not just Chinese scholars or Japanese scholars or people interested in China and Japan, but others of us who had been through Peace Corps. I was in Turkey for 2 years and had done a Peace Corps stint there, and also then was in the second year of my Middle East Studies MA at Harvard, and was introduced to Ezra and recruited into that program. And so were people from Morocco, who had worked in Morocco, who had worked in Tunisia, who worked in Nigeria, many were Peace Corps people, who worked in Russia, etc. So there are people with all different interests. And he was setting up this comparative program so that we could talk across and do these connections that that were globalized as opposed to regionalized. And it was incredibly important for me because of various political things that happened in Turkey. There was a coup at the time I was supposed to leave for the field. My husband and I ended up in Azerbaijan, Iran. And that flexibility was just fine with Ezra. He was my dissertation advisor. And he was interested in Iran right up until the end of our very last communication, when he wanted to know what we, the U.S., were doing to Iran with the sanctions that were actually in 2019. So it was really a serendipitous thing when Byron and I returned from our graduate education here, and we went to Davis, California, and returned in 1983. And I became a faculty member and professor at the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School. And because Arthur Kleinman, who many of you heard this morning, was on the board of Fogarty, we were asked by Arthur to write a Fogarty grant for psychiatrists from Beijing and Shanghai, and to head up a project at the Department of Social Medicine, which would bring young psychiatrists and some of their leaders to Harvard for a year. And it was really Ezra who helped us think about what was going on in China and what our young psychiatrists would learn in the year that they came. This program lasted for 17 years, and we relied on Ezra and Charlotte to come to the session we would hold every year, where they would present their projects and their field work. And it was incredibly generous of both Ezra and Charlotte to give the time to those young psychiatrists. And they were affected by him and affected by Charlotte too. And there was a kind of generational ripple. This project, this Fogarty International Program for training Chinese psychiatrists, changed Chinese psychiatry. It was a revolution in Chinese psychiatry. So it lasted between 2000 and 2017. And the people who came out of that program rewrote the law, the mental health law, and they also led a revolution in psychiatric practices, psychiatric research, ethnographic research, and redesigned mental health for the entire country. So that is just one of the ripples that occurred. When I was given an award by the Harvard Medical School in 2019 for mentoring, I thought of Ezra. And I thought of what made him my mentor-in-chief. Not only being accepted to the graduate program and being a wonderful mentor during that time, his ethnographic and historical and detailed lectures on Japan and China were such an inspiration, and they taught me how to learn about another society. In particular, in the Japan lecture course, it was in William James 1. He told us in detail about the variety of kitchen equipment in Japanese salarymen's homes. So it's not only food, but it's also the kitchen equipment that was important. And it struck me how to pay attention at that time to what small things reveal about economic and cultural transformations. I took that lesson to the field in Iran and to my dissertation research and every other thing I've done since. I recall that he wrote on my thesis, noting that it was impressive, but that I could have included more economy about the Iranian town in which I had studied during 72 to 74. I'm so grateful for what he did, and my students are too, because over the years of my 40 years of teaching at Harvard, I shan't forget how he helped me over bumps and major hills, and that I should do that and try to do that myself and try to instill that in those people that I mentored over this time, both in FAS and at the medical school, through our many postdoctoral programs. So, extraordinary mentor. The day before he died, I was composing an email on details on Iran and Indonesia to answer questions that he asked me the previous year, because I was always delayed, always late, always trying to catch up with Ezra's curiosity. Slamet Jalan, old friend.
Thank you, Mary Jo. Rick, can we turn to you?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Mary Jo.
For several reasons, it's difficult for me to do this. First of all, beginning in the 1980s, we would have an annual reunion in Japan of Ezra's, we called them Ezra's acolytes. And we did it every year. At the beginning of the year, he would give us a schedule of when he would be coming to Japan. We would pick a date, and then we would get people together. It was usually 50 people. But after Japan is #1, and he became such a celebrity, the session turned into simply giving praise to the great sensei, and it was boring and it was useless. So we set a rule that if anybody would praise Ezra over the course of the evening, they had to pay a 10,000 yen fine. So I came armed. And because Ezra wanted to hear what we were doing, and it was useless, we all knew it. So to praise Ezra actually in one way is easy, in one way is difficult. I started with Ezra in 1967. That's the first time I met him. went to his office. I was in regional studies. I was actually wanted to work with Robert Bella. Nobody told me that Robert Bella was not going to be here. He had gone to Berkeley. And Ezra immediately, he was still moving in. He had just gotten his appointment in sociology, but he was moving into 1737 Cambridge Street, which was the old building across the street, in a room that it was at a hotel that had been made over by Fairbank and the crew for the East Asian Research Center. And he was moving in, he was happy to be there, and he said, yeah, come here. And immediately, because I had spent time in Japan, he said, I have this course on Japanese society, will you be my TA? First time I meet him. And I said, well, I don't know. And he said, well, come over to the house. So we walk over to Parker Street, and he always fixed bacon and tomato sandwiches, so much for the Jewish boy from Ohio. And so I did it. And I think in the first class, Andy Gordon was a student. Andy, you were a freshman, and you got permission somehow to take this upper level course. And of course, Andy became a stellar star. So that began the relationship. When I got word from Corky White that Ezra died, it would have been the 20th or the middle of the night. It was just before the Japanese year-end holidays, and all of us who got this, we didn't expect it. Ezra didn't expect it, I'm sure. So I had to go to the I House for an errand, and I went into the library at the I House, and his death was on all the television stations. It was on all the news programs. It was in all of the newspapers. He had that kind of celebrity in Japan. So the librarians in the I House knew about it, and they come up and tell me how sorry they are. We're having this thing with the librarians. And they said, we want to put together a display of his works, but they only had his Japanese works. I said, okay, we'll do it. I'll go home and we'll work on it, and I've got all the Chinese stuff. And so as a result, I started over Oshogatsu reading Ezra's works. And a lot of them, here's my copy of Canton Under Communism, which is disintegrating. And it was quite an experience. I'll have to say that as somebody who is specialized in Japan, of the books that he wrote, the one that I kind of like the least is Japan is Number One. And when he did the manuscript for Japan is Number One, he sent it out to a lot of people. This was before email. You didn't get attachment. We got it in manila envelopes, and so a whole community got it, and many people advised him, Ezra, this is not up to your level of scholarship. It's too superficial. Ed Reischauer advised him, Ezra, if you publish this, it should be mandatory reading in the United States, because it's really a message for the United States, and it should banned in Japan. But of course, it became an all-time bestseller. I think it's only recently, as a nonfiction book, that the record has been broken. It got up to 500,000 copies, and so. But the one thing that Japan is Number One did was to give Ezra a pulpit, which was an amazing asset. It embarrassed Ezra, but it was an amazing asset to Ezra, and it was an amazing asset to Harvard. He had recognition. The Sunday before I came here, I was at a wedding, and it happened to be a wedding of a high-placed person, the daughter of an LDP politician marrying somebody from the American embassy. So luminaries were at the wedding, and at my table was Kono Taro, Motegi, and two other LDP politicians who Nakano Sensei can tell you about. And then George Olcott, who was a student of Ronald Dorr, who was almost an exact contemporary of Ezra and very close. And over the course of going through the wedding reception, I mentioned that I'm coming here for Ezra's memorial service. Everybody at the table, Ezra Vogel, everybody knew Ezra Vogel. George Olcott was a student of Ronald Dorr, had been very close to Ronald Dorr, and up to the time of his death. And George Olcott talks about Ronald Dorr. Nobody could place Ronald Dorr at the table. And George said, and I said, I really didn't like Japan as #1 that much. I liked the other books better. And George Olcott says, I didn't either. But Ronald Dorr wishes he had written it. and it was one of the regrets of his career. I have to remind people of something. I don't want to take up a lot of time. But my favorite, as it turns out, when I read Deng Xiaoping is a masterpiece. Deng Xiaoping's a masterpiece. He put in enormous time. Ezra is a great interviewer. And he came to Japan, he interviewed everybody who had met Deng Xiaoping. And I got to accompany him. So we met Nakasone, we met O Tabuchi, who was the former chairman of Nomura, all of them had met. We took a trip to Cambodia together. He wanted to meet King Sihanouk. And we actually tried, we had a connection. We couldn't, King Sihanouk was actually in Pyongyang at that time. But we met people in the entourage of King Sihanouk, because in the 1970s and again in 1982, for some reason, when Deng Xiaoping was coming out of his kind of exile, he came out of his exile at dinners with King Sihanouk. It might seem strange, but Sihanouk and Deng Xiaoping were very close. And they were close for a couple of reasons. They were both about the same height. So physically, they didn't feel, they were comfortable with each other. Deng Xiaoping could speak fractured French, and Sihanouk was fluent in French, native in French. But Sihanouk could speak to Deng Xiaoping in French. When Sihanouk was in exile after the Lon Nol coup, he kept his relationship with Deng Xiaoping and would send him tidbits from France. And when both of them were on the outs, when he would come and meet Deng Xiaoping, he would bring croissants. Not as big as the ones they had here this morning, but croissant. The two were very close. And in 1982, not only Deng Xiaoping, but Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang were absent for about a month, and there were all kinds of rumors. And they came back to a dinner with King Sihanouk. And Deng Xiaoping announced to Sihanouk, no, don't worry, everything is fine. We were just out, we were trying to reduce the bureaucracy a little bit, and it's all fine. And he was reassuring his old buddy. And those kind of stories that made it into Ezra's book, those kinds of stories were what Ezra could get out of his interviews. For those of us who were close to Ezra, and we'd meet him and we'd have the friendly small talk and so forth, at some point in the conversation, chances are he would change to interview mode. And he would say something like, Rick, why do you say that? Rick, I don't think so. You have to think about it this way. And then you're into it. And he would do that. I want to say something. Canton under Communism, when it came out at the university, the students hated it. 1967, 1968, 1969 was the Cultural Revolution at Harvard. The social relations department was in turmoil. The students in social relations had invented this thing of having certain classes without the supervision of faculty. That was an innovation. it was a very difficult time. And this book came out about the same time as Barrington Moore's famous book on grand theory. Let me tell you why the students hated the book. Page 350. Much of what the communists did in Guangdong follows logically from pre-liberation trends and might have been done by any government able to keep the peace. The communists expanded municipal government, but municipal government had been expanding ever since its founding in 1921. The communists built a powerful party organization, but the Kuomintang had developed Leninist party organization under Russian guidance in the 1920s. This is Ezra interviewing himself. The communists expanded public education, but they drew heavily on experiments in missionary and government schooling earlier in the century, and it goes on and on. That's not what students at Harvard, the Maoist faction, William Hinton was on campus. William Hinton, who wrote Fancy, he gave Ezra a horrible time. He heckled him in his classes. This is not what students wanted to hear. But Ezra was an inductive sociologist. He was looking, as Steve said, he wanted to get it right. He wasn't looking, theory for him was a tool. It was part of his toolkit to get it right. He wasn't trying to make theory. That's I think, the legacy. The network that we have here and that approach, that inductive approach to scholarship, I think is the legacy.
Great. Thank you, Rick. Mary? Professor Brenton?
Well, I'm going to echo a few of the themes that have been raised. I didn't realize that would be the case, but if I had to title what I'm going to say, I would title it What I Learned About Ezra. Unlike many of the speakers in the last few days, I was not a student of Ezra's. I wasn't married to Ezra. And I wasn't really his colleague in a formal sense because I arrived at Harvard in 2003 after he had retired. But as we all know, and as Charlotte articulated so beautifully, he never retired. He never really retired. And so from the very beginning of the time I came to Harvard in 2003, I really was a student of his and a colleague. He was actually never director of the Reischauer Institute. I think he directed every other Asia Institute at Harvard, as Professor Rudenstein said yesterday, but he was always there. He was always supporting all of us, every director and of course, every colleague in Japanese studies. So I was thinking, well, what can I contribute, here, having not been a student and not been married to him and not, been his active colleague. And I decided I have one Ezra-related experience that nobody else in this room shares. And that is, I had the honor of soliciting and editing the Japan essays for the Remembering Ezra Vogel book. My former colleague and Ezra's student from many years ago, Marty White, called me from his retirement. I'm not retired yet, and I don't have nearly as much time as Marty, but Marty said, Mary, how about we do this book together? And the model was Fairbank Remembered. And fortunately, the China side, the list on the China side turned out to be quite a bit longer than the Japan list. And that worked out well because Marty is retired and he contacted everybody related to Ezra China-wise, and I contacted all of the Japan side. So in the short time I have, I wanted to reflect on what I learned about Ezra from that process of reading the essays, all of them, the China ones, of course, as well as the Japan ones, and how what I learned in the essays really reinforced what I learned from Ezra over the years before and after I joined the Harvard Social Department. And by the way, one of the things I'll say about agreement with Rick, I too did not like Japan as number one. I was not a fan of Ezra's for that reason. I was a fan of Ezra's for all other reasons. But the main takeaway of what I want to say is echoing what many people have said, I think, and that is that Ezra placed so much value on honest, sympathetic communication with other people, and it was based, I think, on the common experience of place. And this has particular significance for sociology, which I'll say in a moment. So I distilled what I wanted to say into 3 lessons from Ezra. And first, the importance of language. He never gave up, as we all know, on improving his language skills in Chinese and in Japanese. My first experience of meeting Ezra after I came to Harvard was at the house as he was finishing up a session in his living room with his Chinese language tutor. He was age 73. So that was quite inspiring. And observing that and reading what Steve Vogel said about his father's striking up conversations with random Chinese and Japanese people in the airport and in restaurants really told me how deeply Ezra valued being able to converse with people in their own language. As we all know, and it's written about in some of the essays in the book, Ezra gave lectures in fluent Japanese when he went to Japan every year, and he delivered speeches in fluent Chinese when he was in China. And I can't think of any other American scholar, maybe there are some, but I can't think of any who could do that and who were so devoted to continuing to do that. I was in Tokyo last week, finally, after 2.5 years of sakoku. And, and I was reminded again of Ezra's persistence in mastering Japanese expressions, because I found myself engaging in long, sometimes rather complicated conversations with journalists, politicians, and old friends after having been away from Japan for so long. Searching for the right words, I thought, I need to keep trying to be more like Ezra. Because whether grounded because of the pandemic or not, Ezra would have been practicing every day. And I hadn't been in the United States. So I became painfully aware of that, and I thought a lot about Ezra. Lesson number 2, as we all know, the importance of place. On some occasions, I would run into Ezra on campus. When I ran into him, I would happily report that the social department was going to be hiring a new assistant professor. His first question was always, do the top candidates have international interests? And to his visible dismay, my answer was almost always no. Ezra was very distressed about that, as was I, always. As American sociology, along with some of the other social sciences, increasingly turned to the study of America and veered away from comparative studies, Ezra fretted. Florence Kluckholm, one of Ezra's graduate advisors, had been among the first to convince him of the value of comparative studies. It was a lesson he obviously carried with him throughout his life and practiced, and he believed that this was one of the great contributions that social scientists could make. And I think we have to be very, very careful to preserve that belief and that legacy and work on it. Charlotte talked about also the group of Chinese students from the social department at the house every month. Every Chinese student in the social department was there. I knew them all, and they all sat at Ezra's feet. They all loved him. And Mary Jo mentioned Ezra's attention to detail, his ethnographic work. Rick spoke of his, he characterized Ezra as an inductive sociologist, and I echo all of those remarks as well. Ezra cared about the details, and he cared about talking to people about the details. And the third lesson is always look for the silver linings in a culture. Many people have talked about Ezra's great optimism, and that often came through to me when I spoke with him for the following reason. Stated in old-fashioned terms, I do research on social problems in contemporary Japanese society. And in discussions with Ezra, there was an inevitable refrain. He would inquire about my current research, as he always did when he spoke with his colleagues and students, and I would launch into my studies on gender inequality, rising economic inequality across Japanese society, the increase in unstable employment, the low birth rate, and on and on. All depressing topics, which I love to study. At the end of this, Ezra's inevitable response was, but Japan is still a good place, isn't it? Japan is still a remarkably stable society, don't you think? And so this was the dance that we did. I always looked for the dirt, and he always looked for the positive. And I think I gradually learned over many years that frank and honest analysis of even the dreariest situations, which I tend to study, can indeed culminate in reasoned optimism. When analysis leads to possible solutions and to a sense of hope, which Ezra always had, hope that the greater good can be achieved, it brings people together, as so many people have said. And that is a very important lesson for me because I do study such dreary subjects, and I have learned to imbibe, Ezra's spirit that there's always a silver lining, and there are always ways to look at problems and find possible solutions and talk with people about them. And I think that's one of the many, many reasons why we and the region and the world still very much need Ezra Vogel.
Thank you, Mary. So, Yunli, you have the final comment. Yeah.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. Last but not least, my name is Yunli Li from Aichi University of Japan. It's my great honor and privilege to take this opportunity to come back to Harvard Lecture Center and join this event in honor of Ezra Vogel. Actually, I'm truly delighted to join the panel 5, reflecting on Ezra Vogel and his legacy with Charlotte, Ikels, and my friend, Rick Dyck. I would like to share my direct experiences and episodes during my exchanges with Ezra in the past years. Ezra was a master of napping. He could slip off into a nap on the stage of a conference or seminar, on the train, or anywhere. And then rouse himself later on into immediately awareness. I still remember it clearly that the first time I met Ezra in 1996. I was at an international symposium on the US, China, and Japan relations at the International House in Tokyo. And Ezra had left the room for a while after lunch. When he returned to the venue, he told us with a little embarrassment, I was actually just taking a nap. I still clearly remember that the participants at the venue burst off laughing at his honesty. Later, by chance, I stayed at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard as a visiting scholar from 2004 to 2005, and as a fellow at the Asia Center from 2018 to 2019, before the pandemic. For each year of my stay in Harvard, my exchanges with him became deepened, and I came to know him further. They also afforded me more opportunity to witness Ezra napping. I became interested in Japan after reading Ezra's famous book, Japan as Number One. After I got my PhD degree in economics at the University of Tokyo, I came to teach economics at Aichi University in Nagoya. During my stay at Harvard, I participated in various events organized by Ezra. He's very pleased when I told him that Professor John Fairbank had once been invited to Aichi University to give a lecture. In May 2019, I was invited to talk at a fellow seminar organized by the Asia Center on the topic of the social cost of automobiles and the environment policies in Asia, in a comparative study on China and Japan. Ezra served as the chair, and Professor Andrew Golden, he's gone now, Andy Golden, and Professor Michael McRoy served as discussants. The professor's stimulating comments and lively discussions proved to be very useful for my research. In November 2019, when Ezra visited Hong Kong and Japan in place with the publication of the Chinese and Japanese editions of his new book, China and Japan, Facing History, he gave a lecture at Aichi University in Nagoya. Ezra had strong concerns on the predecessor school of Aichi University, the Towa Dobun Shoin. It means the College of East Asia Common Culture in Shanghai from 1901 to 1945, which was founded by Konoe Atsumaro. He actually spent around 10 pages to describe Konoe and his Towa Dobungai. It means the East Asia Common Culture Association in chapter 5 of his new book. Around 1,000 people attended this lecture. Because there were too many people who wanted to take part in this lecture, we had to select an audience by lottery. At the end of the session, I worked as a chair. I asked Ezra what message he would like to give to the students of Aichi University. This is what he said. As one of my mentors in graduate school told me, and I told my students, the most important part of studying sociology is making friends. It takes a lot of effort and work to understand your friend's point of view, but this is how we are able to learn so much. Friends can teach you essential things that will lead you to deeper understanding of their society. Oddly enough, this was Ezra's last lecture in Japan. In commemoration of this event, and in order to preserve a record of this lecture, we have decided to publish a book of that lecture entitled, this one, the last lecture, Ezra Vogel on China and Japan. I like this picture. Ezra sent it to me before he came to Japan, and I use it to make the poster. This one. And the cover of this book. I love his laughing and napping. Here. This book was published by Arm Publishing House in August 2021, just 1 year ago. This is also a special commemorative publication of the International Center at International Center for Chinese Studies at IG University, where I am serving as the director. In his talk at IG University, after sharing his message to the young students, Ezra reflected on his own journey. He said, "I remain happy that I made so many Japanese friends when I was young. I still keep in touch with them. In fact, the friend that we'll be meeting tomorrow is someone I have known since 1959. I think there is no better way to understand a country than through friends, because you can have fun while deepening your understanding." These records are included in the Japanese version, also in my reminiscence, where Mary and White added the book, this one, Remembering Ezra Vogel. So I'm so glad that I have opportunities to contribute twice in two books in honor of Ezra Vogel, one in Japanese, one in English. I hope I have another chance in Chinese. Ezra cherished his friends through his 9 years of life. There is no doubt that even in heaven, he is still surrounded by many friends, happily chatting. Finally, I would like to share a good news with all of you. The NHK Educational Corporation in Japan has produced a 30-minute documentary film, A Bridge Builder, The Life of Ezra F. Vogel, with a plan and sponsored by the Japan Foundation. I'm so pleased to tell you that the NHK has made 2 versions, both in Japanese and English. If you want to view this documentary film, send me email. I can send back to you a link of the movie. What makes us so delighted is that the title of A Bridge Builder comes from his last lecture in Japan at IG University. And our video cuts of the lecture was also presented at the beginning and the end of this film. I actually got a phone call from the producer of NHK at the beginning of this project. He had read our book, the last lecture, Ezra Vogel on China and Japan, and told me this film may be distributed free of charge to the elementary schools, junior high schools, and high schools in Japan. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. So we have kept you here for going on 10 hours, which I believe is what Ezra would appreciate, that we all hung in there. So I don't want to end with any long comments, but what I would like to say, just very briefly, thank the panelists for these comments. And also just to say, if you get a chance in looking over the program, take a look at the last 4 pages of the individuals that have been here over these 2 days. As I said in my opening comments, that Ezra was a convener of talent. And there's no better testament to that than this. And I would also just like to say the range of speakers which we've heard from the last panel with a promising young graduate student, Aniket, sitting in the back still, who's going to be the future of the field. All the way through assistant professors, associate professors, full professors, professors emeriti, leaders of centers, all the way up through our 2 eminent ambassadors sitting in the front here. When I sent out the messages, I had no idea what kind of response I would get. But I certainly know that Ezra's ability to convene talent, that people responded, not because they got a message from some guy named James Robson. It was Ezra. The fact that this was something dedicated to Ezra, and the fact that people wanted to participate in that. So even in Ezra's absence, he's still convening that talent and bringing people together and bringing new networks together. If you can hang on for just 1 second, I need to get something from behind here just to end our event today. This is just a little token gift for Charlotte and the Vogel family. Since this is the 25th anniversary of the Asia Center, and we had one of our staff members, Jorge, in the back, thankfully is a pack rat, I think by self-definition. So he had an original copy of the Gazette that was published celebrating the founding of the Asia Center by Ezra. And so we have a copy framed here for Charlotte, and also to everyone in the Vogel family, just as a record of that founding of this center 25 years ago. So a closing thank you to Charlotte.
Should I be taking it?
Yes, you should be taking it. We'll deliver it to your house. So, and it was a real pleasure, just to work with you to plan this. We waited a long time. And thank you all to the Vogel family. I know David and Ellen and Stephen and Eve, thanks to all of you and Charlotte for sharing Ezra with everybody here for so long. Thank you.